Brave, agile and loyal, the Seikrets of Kunafa village can quickly become a hunter's best friend. They're also the first known instance of what seems to be a genuinely domesticated wyvern species. So what wild traits made it into their modern counterparts to become such loyal steeds? And what did humanity change? Perhaps the first thing to get the ball rolling is to answer if Seikrets are truly domesticated or not, and in turn what domestication actually means, as it's a concept many seem to struggle with. Domestication refers to physiological, behavioural and genetic changes that occur as a result of multi-generational selective breeding. Taming refers to any wild species that, through captivity, has become used to people. Thus, species like elephants are not domesticated, nor are exotic pets. In the world of Monster Hunter, things like Popo, Aptonoth and Murnos have been tamed and possibly even bred in captivity by people, but don't seem to have undergone actual domestication, at least not yet. Only things like dogs, cats and livestock that have undergone actual changes count. So do Seikrets count? And it's hard to say, but probably. When we see the Guardian Seikrets later in the game, morphologically they can appear very similar to Kunafa Seikrets, albeit with the lack of pigment typically seen in Guardian specimens. If we assume these Guardian Seikrets are from a wild stock, and weren't seized from Kunafa, but that's not impossible, then it seems Kunafa Seikrets may heavily resemble purely wild specimens too, and some domestic species, like more normal breeds of cat, can be very similar morphologically and behaviourally to their wild counterparts. Part of this may depend on what the people of Kunafa initially needed from Seikrets, and much like humanity needed cats to essentially just be wild cats that liked people, Kunafa presumably needed Seikrets to fulfill similar roles as robust mounts to traverse monster-filled deserts and plains. There may be subtle differences between purely wild and Kunafa bred, in things like bone robusticity or limb length to carry people, and Kunafa ones may be larger for this purpose too, but it does seem like there are minimal physical differences between purely wild and Kunafa Seikrets, but the behavioural changes may be much more extensive. Kunafa Seikrets are pretty tended to for most of their needs by their human keepers, but what can we infer about their wild ecology from what we see of them? Like some game birds, Seikrets seem to be generalist ground nesters with precocious young. The Seikret chicks are swift, mobile, explorative, and capable of instinctively feeding themselves, rather than being catered for by the parents. Like many, but not all, ground nesting birds, and indeed many wyverns, Seikrets show minimal nesting behaviour, and appear to lay their eggs partially exposed in dead vegetation. The bright turquoise colour of the eggs would suggest a substance like biliverdin in birds, which gives some eggs their signature colour, and as well as being present in paleognath birds, is also present in non-avian dinosaurs like oviraptors and Deinonychus too. This is sometimes associated with parental care, and in cassowaries it helps their eggs blend in with the tropical vegetation. In the dry grass provided, Seikret eggs do stick out, but it's also possible wild Seikrets are seasonal breeders and lay their eggs in the lush green period in the plains or nest by oases. It's also possible one of the parents sticks by the nest to hide and guard it too. In Tianamus, the eggs also stick out, and it's suggested this is a signal to other females to lay their eggs in the same area to start communal nesting. The Kunafa Seikrets do seem to nest communally in captivity at least, so this could be a valid suggestion for the wild ones, and for this behaviour too. It's also suggested that biliverdin and its green colour can protect from solar radiation as well, which would help in the arid plains. Animals in captivity and domesticated ones often show reduction in certain behaviours, and this can include reproduction. Domestic animals just generally respond poorly to environmental changes due to a lot of their ecology being carried by man. In many instances, Western breeds of domestic dogs are poor mothers without human help, and this limits feral success from such breeds. Domestication of Kunafa Seikrets may result in more lax parental behaviours as their eggs are always sheltered, so this may explain why they're not as well tended as you may expect, and there may well be hard boundaries as to how much we can infer about their wild cousins from the Kunafa Seikrets. This includes when the eggs hatch. and Seikret chicks are boisterous and active. Whilst Kunafa ones generally zoom around getting underfoot in the village, wild ones presumably stay closer to the parents but likely leave the nest after hatching. Seikret chicks are likely very precocious. As said, they're mobile, have a warm downy coat rather than most other examples of flying and bird wyvern chicks which are naked and nutritial, and also feed themselves rather than be fed by parental figures. They will beg for food from human food givers, but this isn't so unusual, and some precocious chicks will have food pointed out to them by parents, or may be gifted food as they forage for themselves, both of them helping chicks to learn what is good and safe to eat. When compared to extant birds and another bird wyvern and perhaps the most avian flying wyvern, Seikrets group well with precocious birds from the behaviours that we see, and are likely most comparable to game birds in the fully precocious category, or button quails, rails and cranes in the semi-precocious category depending on food provisioning. From chick activity it seems that they'd be very likely to leave the nest and follow the parents, and whilst the two aren't seen to interact that much, as said, this may be partially from domestication, and the villagers playing with the chicks too, though it is worth noting the chicks do retreat to the adults in the sand tide. When in the wild, the chicks likely stay closer to the parents, but spread out to forage, with adults possibly giving key food sources to them or showing novel ones to help them learn. Presumably the adults have an alarm call for the chicks to either return to them or hide in cover too. There are many reasons to become precocious, and many flightless ground nesters often are. Convenience is a big one, and it is simply advantageous for the young to feed themselves if it's reasonable for them to do so. Part of this comes from what they eat too. If the species eats relatively easy to forage fare that the chicks can acquire themselves, then the door to becoming precocial is open. This is why many large flying wyverns like the raths and barioth are altricial. As obligate carnivores and big game hunters, the slow and flightless young have little hope of being good enough hunters in a juvenile form, even if on actually reasonably sized prey items. For Seikret diet, they seem to be generalists with a slant for herbivory. With jaws not hugely specialised in any direction, we also see Seikrets will take a range of food. In Kunafa, they're chiefly fed wild-collected seeds and grains, and presumably table scraps too, and the hunter's Seikret will also steal sausages from them. This tells us in the wild, Seikrets likely have a bit of everything, and take a variety of plant and small animal matter in presumably quite a seasonal diet. Nona tells us Seikret plumage changes with diet, and the vegetarian seed and grain diet of Kunafa gives them their signature blue and green look. The diet of pure energy in the form of wilk is also what causes the pigmentless grey guardian Seikrets too. If Seikrets live in the areas directly around Kunafa, in plains and savanna woodland, their plumage may change with the seasons and the differences in food that come with it. Fruits, flowers and foliage in the wet season may result in different colours to grains, browse and small animals in the dry. Some colours may be locally attractive to Seikrets too, whilst certain colours, or faded ones from poor diet, may be unattractive. Bright and novel colours may suggest a Seikret from a different area that's been eating a different diet. This in turn may suggest genetic separation, and make them especially attractive as a mate, due to the innate desire to avoid inbreeding. With at least some information gleaned from Seikrets about what we just see in game, it's then worth asking, what made them candidates for domestication? And in this regard, Seikrets overall do just seem to be a good fit. To look at traits suggested that make animals favourable choices for domestication from early papers, which also likely influenced Jared Diamond's similar criteria in Guns, Germs and Steel, and overall Seikrets seem to tick most of them from the knowledge we do have. They're easy to feed with generalist diets, they're social, they'll breed in captivity, and they're not unreasonably aggressive or overly flighty. For Tennyson and Hudson, their parental behaviour is ticked as well, and whilst we know little of their growth rates nor Seikret mating, nothing suggested seems overtly unusual or unreasonable for them. So to answer what makes them good candidates for domestication, everything really. The Seikrets do seem to be something of a very rare Goldilocks species in Monster Hunter, that probably ticks every box you could ask for domestication. But with that, how did it happen? And it may be possible that one of the early factors in facilitating it was the sand tide. When we see the sand tide comes in, the Seikrets will hide in the caves. And before the people of Cunafa became settled in and built their village, it's likely they also sought shelter in the cave areas as well. This would have brought the two into close contact, with both of them likely learning that the other was harmless. Over time, Seikrets would have become habituated to people, and the two became comfortable with one another, with Seikret chicks growing up alongside people and human children as well. The first ride may well have been a playful child climbing atop a Seikret's back and not getting thrown off, before everyone got the same idea when a predator showed up later. But domestication still isn't just as simple as slapping a saddle on an animal and going to town. It generally takes multiple generations. In some regards, Seikret domestication may partially resemble the newer dingo model suggested for wolf-to-dog domestication, of humans taking weaned wolf pups from dens and raising them to adulthood, and then these tamed wolves returning to the wild but to live and den in human-adjacent areas, and often scavenging their mammoth kills, thus providing closer and easier wolves to acquire for future taming until they finally stayed in human settlements to den, and selective breeding began. Similarly, people may have adopted lost Seikret chicks in the sand tide, or have taken eggs from nests, and reared habituated Seikrets that spent more time around the village and occasionally acquired food there, until a compatible male and female just bred in the village itself and the Seikrets moved in fully. This would keep genetic diversity higher to a point, albeit slowing domestication, by keeping in wild admixture. And this is something likely seen in other domestic species too, with horses getting mixing from wild specimens at some points in their own domestication journey. This doesn't last forever, and domestication is often earmarked by a sharp drop in genetic diversity and an increase in deleterious mutations. Whether intentional or not, Cunafa may occasionally outbreed Seikrets with wild specimens to prevent inbreeding. It may be just as simple as, if we think it's gross, the Seikrets shouldn't do it either, or it may just be done because they become aware it results in healthier and better mounts. Seikrets at this point may also just not be removed enough from wild specimens to have undergone the domestication drop as well. As suggested, Seikrets may not have undergone two major physical differences from their wild forms. The most likely ones would be to make them larger and leggier, as is the case with horses or really anything you want to carry either you or loads. Humans are quite heavy, and Seikrets are also clearly quite strong with the loads they can carry and still maintain a good pace at. Most reptiles and similar animals tend to start quadrupedal and then become bipedal for greater speed. Though the Seikret is a rare reversal in this regard, it's not so different from other wyverns, which often show a tendency to return to quadrupedal movement for certain actions typically requiring speed or stability. The full quadrupedal sprint is facilitated by the Seikret's very flexible and mammal-like spine, but is still probably best summed up as such, a sprint. Lore in the concept art says that Seikret limbs are best for endurance rather than explosive movements. And so in the grand scheme of things, their sprint may not be all that fast and especially not very energy efficient, even if it is the fastest option the hunter has while mounted. Whilst gameplay obviously allows for indefinite sprinting, Seikret morphology may be poorly optimised for both sprinting overall and keeping up such speeds compared to bipedal jogging. Behaviourally, Seikrets have likely undergone some changes too. This is already clear in the risks Seikrets are willing to take with and for their riders, still showing sufficient awareness to directly avoid large monsters, but engaging in abnormal levels of peril. Reduced fear is an early factor in domestication, as many animals need to get over their fear of large or threatening humans to function in domesticity as domestic animals. Whilst, as said, you'd still want a Seikret with sufficient caution that it knew what to flee from, and not to charge blindly down a monster's throat, it also can't just bolt and abandon or even buck off its rider in a monster attack. Whilst not the same level of tameness and overconfidence as some of our domestic pets, Seikrets are still abnormally bold for what they are, likely from selective breeding for it. One thing interesting said is that Seikrets apparently view people as friends. which some may take to mean that Seikrets essentially view people as other weird Seikrets. Something occasionally said about cats too. Is this likely to be the case? And no. The book this came from actually said that cats don't modify their behaviour specifically for humans. They react the same as they might another cat, but that doesn't mean they think everything else is a cat. Whereas dogs do change such behaviours. Dogs act and treat humans differently to other dogs. They have lived in closer proximity and in more of a direct working/companion role than any other domesticated animal, and as such have essentially evolved around us as companions. This requires dogs to be very attentive to human behaviour and gestures for this to work, for which dogs have an amazing sense to read. The easiest and most well-known, of course, comes from pointing, where dogs look to where a human points, thus showing they understand the gesture a dog couldn't make, but extends to gaze as well, where dogs will follow where a human is looking for cues. On this same level, Seikrets are likely very perceptive to human actions, gestures, emotions, and commands, as we can see in some parts of the game. Whether Seikrets are on the same level as dogs is hard to say, as Seikrets are less expressive and also don't have quite the same variety of roles. But it is clear they're a notable stage above just tamed animals. Dogs and Seikrets don't just change to learn about humans as they're domesticated. They do so as they grow and mature too. They don't just learn about humans, they specifically learn about their humans as well, and the behavioural idiosyncrasies we have to be better companions. Seikrets are still described as stubborn, and that riding them isn't for everyone, so they're perhaps not that far from their wild ancestors. While they're very comfortable with people overall, and new people as well, they're said to not let just anyone ride them, and they generally don't like multiple riders. And this is interesting, in that it shows strong preferential associations. This is essentially the zoological term for friendship, a partnership that goes above the average one of a group living species. This is seen in a lot of social species, and is both readily documented in the literature, and can be seen in casual long-term observation too. A fair amount of the time it can be explained at least in part by kin associations, with animals preferentially associating with related members of their social units, and more closely related ones too. But obviously, Seikrets aren't related to people, and in our natural world this also isn't always the case too. In some cases it suggested it may form from longer lifespans, and essentially be the choices made by animals over time, after multiple interactions with other group members. Essentially the same way we form our own friendships. The longer you live, the better your data set of interactions is when you decide who you want to spend your time with. In giraffes, it's also been suggested to stem from how they rear their young. Giraffes have single calves that they crash together with one female or a small group, while the other mothers go off to feed. And the bonds calves form in the creche can last for their adult lives. It does seem in Kunafa village that the village children are essentially allowed to play and interact freely with the Seikret chicks. And so it may be that both factors contribute to the preferential associations Seikrets show for their riders. As the children and chicks grow up together, Seikrets and people essentially develop favourites in the groups, based on their age cohort and the interactions they've had together over their lives, until the Seikrets are large enough to take their chosen villager for their first ride. The Seikrets presumably mature a lot faster than people, hence why someone as young as Nona has an adult Seikret of her own. This also feeds into Kunafa's pacifist morals too, with cruel or aggressive children certainly not being favoured by the Seikrets, and so having less mobility in the world. Overall, I really like the Seikrets. I think they're a fitting part of the Monster Hunter world and a nice gameplay feature, and hopefully we'll see them in games to come as well. I do think they trump the Palamutes on all levels essentially. An Archaeopteryx-like dog bird is just a lot more Monster Hunter aesthetically than just dog. For rides they were a bit trapped design-wise. More lupine or monstrous mounts are near universally evil-coded in fiction, and would have clashed with Rise's cuter, kitschy aesthetic. Although I still think they could have gone for something more like a Sheeb or a Keeta for the setting. Design-wise, the Seikrets are very classic paleo art. As mentioned, they do seem quite heavily based off early drawings of Archaeopteryx. and sport the same paleo-art meme colour scheme they often had with the blues and greens. It does also feel like there's a bit of boga in there too. From day one, people always talked about whether we'd ever get a rideable or tamed version of a monster, and I think Seikrets fill that role admirably. Not having the Seikrets engage in combat is also a good idea. Wilds definitely did not need another helping hand in that regard, and already the wound system is pretty gratuitous. I've seen some compare summoning the Seikret to Wirefall, and this is pretty disingenuous if you ask me. Seikrets are far slower and don't set you up for instant counterattack anywhere near as nicely too. For the most part, I think limiting them to traversal only is generally the better choice, but I think you could combine them in set-piece hunts like the Balahara or Jindahad chases. For the latter, I thought the chase sequence was really good, and should have been longer ideally. You could also flip it on its head and have one quest start with a swift fleeing monster that you have to run down on Seikret back, attack and then bring to bay before dismounting for the proper combat. I think having something like the Seikret also just opens up map choices a lot too. Having much more open spaces means we'd probably be able to delve into grasslands and other open country habitats, which is pretty exciting. From a lore-wise point too, the Seikrets also seem to be there to give an extra middle finger to the ancient civilization / Wyveria. Seeing the relationships of the Kunafa Seikrets and then the rabid dogs the Guardian Seikrets became, I think really shows the difference between the two settlements. Wyveria was a sprawling super advanced city and presumably empire too, and forged the greatest weapons of the known world, but could never actually befriend nature as much as they could just cow it, and as a result were destroyed by their own guardian, whereas the Kunafa Seikrets will risk their lives for their human partners and vice versa. On the lore side of things, the little details around Kunafa village with the Seikrets are also just really nice. I think the biggest thing to stymie their return, other than just the developers generally looking to the future, would be water combat. Seikrets don't look like especially good divers, and you'd presumably need a water mount if it was brought back. Lore-wise, I think you can easily add on to the End of Wild's ultimate that Kunafa gave the guild a bunch of eggs and gravid females as thanks for their actions too, so no real issues there. The main complaint I have is to just let the Seikret be stationary. I have no idea why they thought it was a good idea to have it be permanently moving, and it's agonising. It makes gathering on the trot so annoying, and the first time I ever did an endemic live quest I trampled the poor tracktail lizard to death by mistake. Good thing Alma wasn't there. Tighten up the controls and they'll truly be golden. As overall, the Seikret is a great addition to the world of Monster Hunter, and one I hope to see in future games. Thanks for watching. And thanks as ever to my patrons, Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Super Stuper, DJ, Samburgo, K Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Dapperaptor, Aristocrat Mojo, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu, whose generosity supports the channel. Thanks to Kamen Rider Moten for both gathering screenshots and creating their own custom CGI artwork for the channel as well. You can follow them on the links in the description and also commission your own pieces too if you wish. Thanks to I Am the Kaiju King for creating the Sacred Skull and Skeleton for the video. For more skulls, skeletals and custom artwork, be sure to follow them on their Tumblr, with the link provided in the description. If you're new to Monster Hunter and this channel, here I partially break down the creatures of fictitious worlds with science from ours. If you like this video and want more, then be sure to like, subscribe and share this video with others who you may think will also enjoy it. Many of the world's newcomers are yet to come. But in the meantime, both Rathalos and Rathian, Yankutku, Gypsaros, Gravios, Kongolala and Blangonga, Narsilla, Odogaron, Anjanath, Gormagala and Mizutsune have already been covered, so be sure to check out their videos if you enjoyed this one. And there are also plenty monsters from past titles not in Wilds for you to look at too. On top of that, I also have other videos on other fictional worlds like Skull Island, Primal and House of the Dragon if you're interested. If you really liked the video, a link to the Patreon is provided in the description too, and any amount is always appreciated. Paid members also get to vote on future monsters. and so we'll be deciding the order in which the roster of wilds and related topics are covered. So to my regulars, that's essentially the plan going forward, back to making more Monster Hunter content more frequently again. And without further ado, the winner of the Patreon poll and next video will be